Hey everyone, welcome back to the stream. Tonight we're going to have a look at Snowflake IDs and creating minimal APIs. So it's a continuation of our last stream where we looked at what Twitter Snowflake IDs are. If you don't know what they are, do have a look at the previous stream. In this stream, we're going to take that a step further and create a minimal API, an ASP.NET Core .NET 6 minimal API. It's a bit of a mouthful, and we'll see if we can get something up and running and ready for use. So I did manage to stick the code from the last stream into GitHub. So there is now a repo. If you go to rehan/snowflake ID, you'll find the link to the repo and the YouTube video as well. I should probably put a link to the previous video. This is the current one. I'll do that in a minute. And we're now going to just carry on and see if we can get that minimal API up. So here's the repo. I renamed a few things. I probably shouldn't have. I think this was called Snowflake Generator before. And I've been just playing around. I renamed this to Create Snowflake ID. And I did write the tests that I said I would. So let's just briefly just talk about that. So I think I wrote this test here, where we ensure that if the clock moves back on the machine, and that the Create Snowflake ID throws an invalid operation exception, because that's just not going to work. It's liable to create duplicate Snowflake IDs in that case. And I think I wrote a couple more tests in the options class here to just ensure that we can change the number of data center bits. And if we set them incorrectly, we throw an argument out of range exception. So now we have a fully configurable set of options for our Snowflake ID. We've got loads of things we can set in our constructor over here. Each of them has a default as well. We don't want a default for the epoch because we want the user to be able to set that. So let's get started on an API. So I thought we'd start file new project. Web API, we'll go next, and we'll call this Snowflake ID. Well, we'll just call it ID.API maybe, just to go with the rest of the projects. And we'll go next. We'll stick that in the source directory. Configure for HTTPS, yes. Why not? We'll go for Docker. And use controllers, no. So we're going to go for minimal APIs. Add open API support, yes. So let's create that project. Now we have that. Here's our application, and we have a default get over here. And now we'll need to think about what we want our API to look like, what we want it to do. So let's get rid of some of these comments. We know how all of this works. And we can get rid of the weather forecast class because we're not going to do a weather forecast API. And we will call our API endpoint Snowflake ID. Or yeah, what should we call a good endpoint name? So I want two endpoints really. So the first one, let's just get rid of some of this code for a minute. So the first endpoint I want is you call it and we return a single Snowflake ID. The second one I want is you call it and you can pass in like, I don't know, count equals 5, and we return an array of 5 Snowflake IDs. I think that would be useful if you were ever doing a bulk create to save you from having to call this API 5 times. So yeah, we could just make this the same endpoint. Those don't need to be the different ones. The examples would be complicated though. So by examples, I mean the OpenAPI examples. So if we go back and bring this back, bring that back, run this guy, set a startup project with that. Don't do Docker, do just Kestrel. We'll run that really quick. What browser is it using? Let's brought this up on the other screen. We can go to this endpoint over here. We'll bring up a new window. Is /weather forecast, isn't it? Something like that. That totally didn't work. Why didn't that work? /weather forecast, that totally should have worked. Is it? Here we go, HTTPS. So there we have our weather forecast. Where's our OpenAPI endpoint? Use Swagger UI. I can't remember what the endpoint was for Swagger. Is it Swagger index? There we go. So if we go here, you get an example of what the API returns. And in the case where you want a single Snowflake ID, you want like one JavaScript object containing like an ID and then the number. And in the case where you have multiple, you want an array of them, I suppose. No, not an array. We'll come on to that in a second. So let's really create our view models that we're going to return. So we'll create, it's not going to let me edit that, is it? Yeah. So hot reload doesn't save you from being able to add new folders. View models, and we'll create a new quick view model for Snowflake ID. There we go. That works. This could even be a record. It's a U-long. This is a thing where if you're using records, normally we have a thing in .NET where we put each class or type in a new file. There's even warnings that things like style cop analyzers provide to ensure you do that. But when you're using records, yeah, it doesn't make a lot of sense anymore. And we're going to do another class, Snowflake ID collection. No, not collection. Snowflake ID items. Well, I'll call it items for now. I haven't got a good name for this class yet. And we're gonna, this is going to include, this can be a record class too, a IEnumerable, well, a list of a list of Snowflake IDs, and we'll call that Snowflake IDs. and we'll call that items. Let's call it items. So let's go back to our program. So we'll call that, and this is not going to be a get, it's going to be a map. Post map post, and we'll return a Snowflake ID. But to do that, we need to set up our Snowflake service. So we'll add a reference, add project reference to our ID project, and we'll add singleton Snowflake ID option service, and we also want to configuration dot configure, no, not add configuration dot services dot configure Snowflake ID options, and we'll do builder configuration dot get section get what do I do here normally? Dot get section, get required section I often call. Yes, there we go. And we'll call this Snowflake ID. So now we can configure our options in from the app settings.json file. And we'll stick a section in here. We'll remove the word options, and we'll go over here to our options and work out what we need to set here. So we want an epoch. In fact, can I just clean this up slightly? Data center ID. We want all this to be configurable. The defaults for these can be 0 in our case. The number of bits we want, we'll just stick with the defaults for now. Data center bits is 4 and worker ID bits is 6. 4. Worker ID bits is 6. And that's it. And we'll grab that, stick that in there. And now for the epoch, we want a date and a time. And we'll just say our epoch is middle of the night today. So 2021, 11:05. And we'll the time will be 00, 00, 00, 00, 00. So there's our epoch. So hopefully those options should now pop into this service. And now over here we need to grab that service. So we want our Snowflake ID service, create Snowflake ID, new Snowflake ID from our view models, and we're going to pass that in there. That should work. And we'll just clean up this formatting a little bit. And we will call this why don't we use the same name as, so this name is used by the Swagger API endpoint to give it a unique endpoint name. It's also good for if you want to generate a URL for this endpoint. you need this endpoint name as well. So it's a good idea to have this as a constant somewhere where you can reuse it. So we'll create constants folder, and we'll call this endpoint name static. That's a static class. It was suggesting something there. That doesn't seem like a very good suggestion. That's a better suggestion. Let's tab that. Let's tab that, and we'll play around with this. We'll call this Flake ID. So that's to get one endpoint, and we'll call that post because that's the HTTP endpoint. Oh, here's a trick I often use. Name of Snowflake ID. So this is a string with a value of post Snowflake ID, and I'm using name of this thing here to make sure that these two names are the same. So if I was to rename this, this would get renamed, and if I was to rename this, this would get renamed. So we can use that, and then we want another endpoint where we create items. So we'll go back to our program, and we'll say this is endpoint name dot post Snowflake ID, and we will. So let's just to make sure that works first. We'll stick a breakpoint in there as well. Some services are not able to be constructed. Snowflake ID service unable to resolve service for type Snowflake ID options. Oh, okay. I forgot to do this. Builder. So by default, I registered this Snowflake ID options, and in the service, it's looking for I options. That would work, but I don't want to have to do that. A better way is builder dot services dot add singleton. Where's add singleton? I can't see it. There it is. We're going to call it Snowflake ID options, and we're going to say service, or we're going to say x dot get required service I options Snowflake ID options. So what this is doing, what am I missing? Oh yeah, dot value. What this is doing is it's pulling out I options Snowflake ID options from the dependency injection container, pulling out the Snowflake ID options and registering that as a singleton. And now this should work. I can get rid of this code as well. Cool, there's our Snowflake ID endpoint. There's our example code, which we'll have a look at updating in a minute. We'll try that out, we'll execute, and we got something weird happening. Oh, is that because I edited? Didn't I do hot reload? Can I hot reload this? No parameterless constructor defined. What? This is a class. Oh, to be an options type, it needs to have a parameterless constructor. Oh, okay. So that messes with our options class a fair bit, because we'd like some defaults and some validation. Maybe we should rework this a little bit, and we could provide it would be so nice to be able to just configure this in here. So I think we should rework it. Let's think about that for a second. I could provide a parameterless constructor, but then the next problem we're going to run into is that these are just getters and not setters as well. So although I didn't want to do that, max data center ID. Then I need to move this content out from this constructor to the various properties instead. So yeah, that's annoying, isn't it? Okay, let's think about this for a second. Could make these init properties as well. So they can be initialized. They must be initialized. This is a getter, and this is just going to be equal to this. So that can be changed to that. This can be changed to that. This is going to get recalculated every time though you call it. So how often does it get called? It doesn't get called here, and this gets called here as well. Oh, it's just to check for validation. We could let's sort out the epoch first. We need a field. There we go, we've got that set. So now if you set that with an incorrect epoch, that will throw. That's what we want. And then we can do the same with the data center bits, data center ID bits. Worker data center ID bits set I'll stick that in there. Value is less than equal to 0. This dot data center ID bits equals value. And we need to do the same with the worker ID bits. And we'll cut that, stick that in there. What's the next one? Data center ID bits plus worker ID bits is, okay, so this we need to check. We'll create a private function for this. We'll call validate bits. And we will need to pass in the bits in here. So that becomes, no, then we need to validate that here. So this is going to be value this dot worker ID bits. Oh, but this is not going to work. This is not going to work because if you set one and then the other one's not set yet, that's going to fail. I think we need to rethink this idea. Maybe we need a public validate function on here. And we will validate that in our service. So then this all goes away. And we need to validate this stuff as well. What's this? This would go into the validate function as well. And then these would no longer be argument out of range, argument exceptions. We'd need to change the exception type because we're no longer validating arguments to this function. And we will need to set the defaults. Data center ID equals 0, worker ID equals 0 as well, and then the data center ID bits equals 4, worker ID bits equals 6. Now we have our defaults set. Put some semicolons in there. We've broken all our tests, mind you. Now we have a validate function. We'll need to call that from options.validate in our service, and we'll throw a new does this have? We can't pass the param name anymore. Don't need to do that. We just pass in the message there. Can't be greater than must be equal to. That was an incorrect exception there. Data center ID can't be greater than. We should probably put the data center ID into this exception message so users can know what it actually equals. And the same goes for the worker ID here. We'll do the same here in this exception. Always give your users a nice exception message. And it's getting a bit long, so let's wrap that. So now we have our validate function. Let's quickly go fix our tests. Let's ignore the test for now and just make sure that this works. So if I fire this up now, that should work. Still have my weather forecast class that I need to remove. That started. Refresh, try it out, execute. There's our Snowflake ID service. There's our options. What do we have? Data center ID. We seem to have picked up our options from app settings.json, which is good. And let's generate an ID. Got an ID and we can return it. And we have our ID. Excellent. I could have just returned a number here. But typically with APIs, you don't want to return just some raw value, just in case you need to extend this API in future and return something else. So say, for example, in the future, I needed to return the time when this ID was added. So I might have like creation time, and then I could add that. If I was just returning the number, I wouldn't be able to do that. So returning an object as opposed to a raw value provides future extensibility. Yeah. So we have the Kestrel HTTP header being returned as well. You can normally want to turn that off. You don't want to give people an idea of what web server you're using, defense in depth and all that. Otherwise you're just going to get hacked. Because there are people who just literally, they make requests to thousands of servers. They just write, it's very easy to write an API that does that, or some sort of worker that just scans loads of endpoints and checks for, you know, the thumbprint of the web server and to see if it's vulnerable so that it can be attacked. So we can just simplify this into a nice one-liner. Get rid of that. Get rid of that. Get rid of that. And we're done. Have I got too many? What am I missing here? Map post. Yeah, there we go. So there's our Snowflake ID. We want another endpoint where we can return multiple. Let's get rid of this weather forecast class. In this one, we want account int count equals 1, I guess, the default. Why is it erroring? The name counter not exist in the current context. And here, I'm going to go back to a full form. How do you do parameters in this new world? From query. Can I not do that? Minimal APIs. How do we do parameters really quick? Just give me something Scott Hanselman. Give me something really quick. Nope. I could go to the docs. I just want a really, really quick example. Here we go. Is happy. That's what I'm doing. What am I doing wrong? Cannot convert from to request delegate. That works fine. Oh, did I miss that? Yeah. Too many brackets everywhere. There we go. Count equals, let's do a count of something useful, like, well, let's default it to 1. Doesn't like that anymore. Again, can I not default? Okay. If count is less than equal to 0, count equals 1. Just some basic validation there. And we want to return enumerable dot range. Well, no. For I equals 0, I is less than count. There's our Snowflake ID, and we want a list of these. Not very clever there. The GitHub, whatchamacallit? What's the thing called that predicts the code for you? Oh, I can't remember the name of it now. Snowflake ID dot add, and we want to return there we go. How about that? we could just change, you know what? Let's just change this one. Let's make this post Snowflake ID. If the count equals 1, return this. Otherwise, return this thing. And we're going to fall into our trap here. Result.ok. Results.ok. We could even simplify this further. If it's less than equal to 1, do that, otherwise do this. Brilliant. Let's fire that up and make sure we have it right. Required parameter int count was not provided from query string. So let's make it not required. I think we can just make it nullable, and that will make it not required. And we also need to put in a condition here to say count dot if it doesn't have a value, or count dot value, and we will need to stick that there as well. Whoops, what have I done there as well? Let's try that. So we're going to refresh that, try it out, execute. We get 1. Let's do 0, 1, 2. Now we get our items, our multiple IDs, and these are different. Notice the sequence number has gone up. Brilliant. If I hammer it, if I asked for 10, 93, 94, 95, 96, 97, 98, 99, 200, 201, sequence numbers going up. And we can request, it's probably a security vulnerability here, we can request too many. So we probably want some validation here. Now my understanding is that minimal APIs don't allow you to use validation. So you can't do something like max value or something like that. That's not possible. So what we have to do here else if count dot value is more than, let's say, a maximum of 1,000, 100, we return results dot add request, and we will probably want a new problem details here. Yeah, I don't really like this. This is where minimal APIs falls down a little bit for me, because it's all very good. In the success case, it's easy to return the correct response, but having no validation built in, I could have just added an attribute here to say max this value out at 100, and that would have been good enough, I think. Let me just make sure that I can't do that. Let me just ensure that that's not possible. I can't remember what the attribute names are, so I'm gonna quickly jump in here to a different. There we go. So we can put in a range attribute, and let's say 100 is the maximum and the minimum is 1. Stop that. Let's see what happens. We'll comment this code out for a moment. See what happens if I run this now. Refresh, try it out, execute. -1. Yeah, it doesn't work. Doesn't like it. So you can't have any validation here, unfortunately. And having to do manual validation like this is problematic because setting up a problem details is a lengthy process. If I was to show you the problem details, what a problem detail should look like, really quick, let's fire up this API over here that I have as an example from the .NET Boxed templates, project templates. This is an Swagger API project template. Let's go over here to, I don't know, post. And look at all the different problem details that you have to handle. So the car is invalid, and this is the type of thing that we want to return. There's a bad request, the status is 400. There's a property that's gone wrong and the property field is required. In our case, we want something different. If we go back, if we just stick that there for a moment, comment that out, and we want our type to be this guy over here. So this is the spec for the 400 bad request. So that's the HTTP spec for that. We've got title bad request. Okay. Title, can we set a title? So all of this comes for free if you use controllers. As soon as you use minimal APIs, you have to do this stuff manually. Now, I don't know if a future version of minimal APIs will include validation for us, but yeah, it's a tough one. And I'm not going to put a number in here because there's status codes dot 400 bad request. That is it's not an enum, but a set of constants for all the different status codes. Trace ID. Why doesn't trace ID exist here? Detail, errors. New problem, HTTP validation problem details. Maybe I need to create one of these other ones. Don't know, I don't remember which one it was. Is it this one? So this one should have a trace ID on it. It's got errors and it inherits from HTTP validation problem details, which includes, no, doesn't include for validation errors. What is the difference? I'm not sure. So then errors It's not a property, is it, that I'm validating? It's a query parameter. Can I do something like this, since extensions? I'm able to pass in a bunch of errors. I wonder what happens. Let's just go back here and validate what happens in a controller when you set the query parameter incorrectly. So ignore all the if defs. I'm just going to set something in here. Range one to 2. Hit F5 on that. So we're getting a single car in this case from this API. And we're just going to test to ensure that what kind of error we get back when the query string is wrong, query parameter is incorrect. It's not that one, it's that one. And we'll try it out, and we'll try 5. That should 4. Did that error? What? Value must be less than 2. Oh, okay. So we're getting the validation at this stage. Interesting. Okay. I wonder what happens if I was to use Postman. Do I have Postman? I don't have Postman. Let's use file new. There's an extension over here I hardly ever use called HTTP client. It's got 39,000. This is not the one I have. There's one I have installed maybe. Let's get rid of that. Where are you? GitHub Copilot, what it was called. REST client, here we go. I can't remember how to use this. Send. How do I fire up a new REST client? .http files. Yeah, there we go. File, new file. I wonder if I can plain text. There we go. Post. Let's get that URL /cars/ID. 4, 5. Send request. Method not allowed. Oh, it's get, isn't it? In our case. One or more validation errors occurred. Here we go. So we got this error in the case of a query string parameter gone wrong. So we can undo that, come back here. Let's have a look at this one. Title, one or more validation errors occurred. Errors equals new dictionary. It's a dictionary of string array. And we're gonna stick in a new one here, car ID. Oh, it's not car ID in our case, it's count. So we can do name of, count, and a string array. So we can't do the range here, so let's get rid of that. And we'll put in a new string array, and we'll say something like this: the field count name of must be between 1 and, we should probably have a constant here, public const int max count equals 100. And you can't have a public constant in here. I can do that though. And I don't know how to get the trace ID in here. That's our next problem. And I'm also not sure whether we should use a validation problem details or a HTTP validation problem details. It's read only. Okay, we'll stick that in there then. And I guess it must be in the extensions. Extensions, instance, errors. So let's take this out over here. Problem. Pass that in there. Something has gone horribly wrong with my indentation. It's probably that. Here we go. And this is max count. And I want to set the trace context. So I think it might be in the extensions. Extensions dot add trace ID. And for that we need the HTTP context. Dot trace identifier. Here we go. Finally. Finally we got there in the end. Let's try that. Not exactly easy, was it, to set an error, set a decent problem details response. Just looking at the comments there. I'm not really sure what you mean by that comment on Twitch. Okay, we were gonna try 1000. We should get a nice problem details response with the trace ID. Brilliant. Field count must be between 1 and 100. All right, excellent. So we've built our API. Let's go and fix our tests really quick. So here we're just setting the epoch. Stop that. Save all. And data center ID equals 16. Here we're doing epoch equals that, and worker ID that. Three bits too high. So these ones are calling the validate function. So I'm going to call validate and we'll new those up. Epoch equals that, and we'll just set data center ID bits equals that, and worker ID bits equals that. Here we'll do something similar. And we need to call validate as well. Oops. That should all work now. Dot validate. That should all work. Let's give that a go. We need to also fix our tests here. Default epoch. Epoch equals that. And we pretty much need to do the same thing everywhere. Data center ID equals 1. In this case it's 2. That's done. In this case we want to set the data center ID to 1 and the worker ID to 1 and this one to 2. And here we want to set the epoch. Epoch here as well. Just copy and paste this code. And here, same thing. Cool. Let's build all. Turn on the live unit testing. We got some broken tests. That is because we changed some of this around a little bit. So if the data center ID is too high, I believe that comes from validate now. So we need to call validate, and then these become validate. Try that. This is throwing a validation exception. And now we have 3 bits too high. That's this guy over here. Let's go back there. Why is that complaining? Expected argument exception. And we got a validation exception. This doesn't need validate. These are the Snowflake ID options ones. Got that wrong. Let's bring those back up here. And we're done. We have working code again. And we have a working minimal API. Really simple. We don't need this anymore. One simple endpoint. Yeah. We could provide an example dot with metadata with name with tags. Produces. We could provide some extra metadata. So we produces status codes dot 200. So we could we provide a 200 OK, and in that case, why is the response type is a Snowflake ID. Content type is application/JSON, but that's the default anyway. So I think that's all I need to do here. Now we also produce items, so we'll add that. It also produces problem, produces validation problem. What's the difference there? Adds with a HTTP validation problem details type for all builders. Adds with a problem details type. So I think we need this one. And status codes dot 400 bad requests. And a content type we don't need to specify. Now this talks about HTTP validation problem details. I don't know why 2 of those exist. I think I'd need to spend some time figuring that out. So let's give an F5 on that and see if that has helped give us some extra information on our schema. We notice that we have our schemas there. Example value. The example value is not very useful. The example bad request value is also not very useful. So that's something that we could improve. The schema is fine. No, is it fine? It's not fine. This is the issue. So what if your API returns 2 different types depending on the parameters passed in? Yeah, a bit of a problem. It's not, this one is overwriting the previous one, so yeah, this is a difficulty with Swagger. Not sure how you could get around that. You could argue that it's not semantically correct with REST to have one endpoint here for two different representations, but I think it's fine. It's more a problem with Swagger. Let's see if we can provide an example here. With display name, with group name, with metadata. Doesn't seem obvious how to provide an example here. I wonder if Swashbuckle has any examples. So there's no examples there. Produces response type, produces response type. We did all that, we added those. Example, that's how to specify an example in comments. Not something I'd advise. Where are you? I've done it before in the controller way. Yeah, here we go. Create a schema filter. Let's go back to my other project and have a quick look. Oh, I am using the comments. Nice or not so nice. Yeah, I don't really like the comments. I would prefer like something that gets compiled and can error if it's wrong. Although the comments is a fairly easy way to get started, it's not a reliable way to go forward. I think we can specify a schema filter or an operation filter and set an example that way, but that's a bit out of scope, I think, for today. We've reached an hour and 15 minutes, reached time. Let's have a quick look here. Let's call it a day over there. So I will check in this code. Let's do that really quick. We'll call that add minimal API. The link to the repo where you can find all this code is in the description. Pull then push. That's all live now. So do have a look at the code. Let me know what you think. If you have any comments, don't forget to ping me on Twitter if you have any questions. Like, subscribe, and it really helps the channel out with the algorithm. And catch me on rehansay.com for some more blog posts and things that I write. Catch you later.